To retrofit buildings into energy efficiency creates more jobs than generating electricity.
Look, I think on the energy efficiency side, there are actually a few tax incentives that do exist. Outputs as part of your projects. And basically how it works is for every kilowatt hour that you save, you get about the equivalent of 95 cents.
Are we, from a curriculum perspective, really training and educating young people to be future fit for these opportunities?
Welcome to the Energy Conversations podcast, your go-to source for unpacking the complexities of the South African energy sector.
Welcome to the Energy Conversations podcast, where we break down the complexities of the South African energy sector into digestible insights. I am your host, Thokozile Zambane, and in today's episode, we explore green buildings and why they are far more than glass facades and solar panels. As the climate crisis deepens and energy costs rise, how we design, build, and retrofit our spaces could determine the future of sustainable living in South Africa. Joining us for this conversation are two powerhouse leaders in the industry. We've got Songo Didiza, who is the founder and CEO of Green Building Design Group, as well as Lisa Reynolds, the CEO of Green Building Council South Africa. Before we dive into today's topic, let's find out a bit more about our guests. Songo, if you could briefly share about your role in the energy sector and the built environment, please.
Thank you, Thokozile, and thank you for inviting us to this wonderful conversation. And yes, by way of introduction, I'm Songo Didiza, I'm co-founder of Green Building Design Group, and we're a sustainability consultancy. We really view ourselves as a partner to infrastructure planning. And we'll talk about infrastructure planning. We're talking about infrastructure planning in the built environment, buildings. And we are the sustainability partner to various design teams, from when you're thinking about putting up a building to when that building gets commissioned, but also post-commissioning, where we bring in the technology to actually monitor the carbon emissions. If you think about buildings, you're building it for about, particularly a commercial building, it's about 24 months. Till it's up and running, and then you're in that building for 40 years plus. So when the technology comes in, it's where we're now monitoring the impact of those buildings in society, and obviously try to minimize that impact using various energy efficient interventions to ensure that we're actually helping the country and the continent get to net zero carbon targets by 2030, 2050 now, not so much 2030. So that's a bit of a lay of the land in terms of what I do in the built environment. And I'm also a pet mom.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for that intro. Pets are very, very important. Our fairy children are also equally important. Lisa, same to you. Give us a snapshot of your current role in the energy sector and the role of the Green Building Council South Africa.
Thanks, Thokozile, and also thank you for the invitation to be on your podcast. So the Green Building Council is a not-for-profit organization, and our vision is to transform the built environment into a place where people and planet can thrive. So we don't focus just on energy. We look at water, we look at waste, we look at really wellness within a building. And doing that, we sort of want to bring South Africa into that low resource or resource efficient space where obviously energy is saved, less carbon's put out into the atmosphere, water is saved, and obviously we try and minimize waste to landfill. And we do that by certification. So we certify buildings, new and existing buildings. We do different tools, including our net zeros. We've got net zero energy, net zero carbon, water, waste, and ecology. And we really try to encourage the property sector and well, anything within the built environment to come along on this green journey with us, so that we can achieve these goals that the government's put out, that people have put out, that people report on. And we also educate, and we advocate. We do a lot of work with the government, also looking at policies and regulations and things like that. So we're trying to assist them with that side of things. So that's really, it's about bringing people along into this green journey with us, and where they need assistance or partnership, that's where we are.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And now that we've set the scene, let's get straight into the why behind green buildings. We often jump straight into the what, but I want us to start with the urgency. And before we unpack the definition, let's start with why now? Why is this conversation so critical in 2025? And maybe more importantly, why should it matter to the average South African who's navigating load shedding, rent, prices of groceries, all the other expense, and not necessarily concerned with climate targets? Songo, I'd like to begin with you in setting out what are the risks or missed opportunities we're facing if we don't rethink how we design and build in South Africa.
Absolutely. So one of my other hats that I wear, Thokozile, is I've got a background in economics. So it's actually one of the reasons why it actually brought me into this industry when I was thinking of doing my master's at Stellenbosch about 10 years ago. It was that, if you follow the money, that's basically where you end up with the answer. And the reality is that buildings are very expensive to run, just thinking about them, beyond the build. But when you start running, the building, if you think about the things that Lisa was talking about, energy, water, we're not just talking about energy and nice facades, but if you look at it holistically, what it actually takes from facilities to operations to leasing it, so you want to keep the tenants happy. And how we work with our partners, when infrastructure planning is really having the tenant in mind, put yourself in the shoes of a tenant. What would they want to see? Tenant will want to see lower utility costs. Sometimes in cases of net zero buildings, you're looking at a zero utility bill, if when done right. And they want to obviously see a lower water. I mean, already we're living in a country where we're quite water stressed, but ultimately you also don't want to be wasting that water. So it becomes that double benefit to both the landlord, where they're not getting their tenants using up all this water resource. And then obviously the other one that never really gets tackled is this waste. I mean, we think about the fact that there's a lot of waste going to landfill, and our landfill is actually running out of space. So just from those three aspects, and another thing that we want to bring in when we talk about green buildings and why now, a couple of years ago, Thokozile, there was this big thing that made the whole world go quiet. That thing was called COVID-19. And I would say that's when green buildings actually, and maybe broadly ESG, where it rose in prominence and in relevance and in urgency, when we all had to sit down and look at ourselves and see, how do we plan better? How do we live in a better world? How do we interact with Mother Nature in a better way? And that COVID really brought out things like, thinking about indoor air quality, and all those things come, and actually, when you think about it, and Lisa actually defined the green building quite well. So when you bring the resource aspect, the health aspect, I mean, actually, a study was done actually by the Green Building Council, and I think other councils in the world, that green buildings actually lead to healthier lifestyles. I think there's a medical company that goes and gives you vitality points for healthy living. So I think green buildings can definitely contend in that regard. So when we looking at the resources, lower utility costs, thinking about health, if you're in a green building, you're in a healthier state of mind. And then obviously, once again, coming back to the occupant, how are they interacting with this? And remember, I said, you're in about 20 to 36 months where you're building this thing, and then you're going to be in it for 40 years plus. And how do you then build that green premium in the sense that it gets spread out across, that entire life cycle of the building? And there's the value add from both aspects: the landlord, the person that owns the building, and then the person that's the occupant that lives in the building. So that's definitely the urgency and the risks that we sit with if we don't particularly, I really think it was an opportunity. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, waste was waste. Now it's actually a resource. So the missed opportunity is not being able to tackle those value chains. A lot of landlords, if you speak to them now, they actually want to place these green assets on their balance sheets. They've seen the value. They're not even thinking of power purchase agreements. They're saying, hey, no, we want to play in the mix. We want to be in the wheeling value chain. We want to be selling electricity. We also want to be. So if you're not thinking about it that way from a value add and a shared value perspective, then you really do miss out on that opportunity, and that opportunity can be shared, both from the landlord, the owner of the building, and then obviously the occupant will get to then derive the benefits of that particular asset.
Thank you for that. That really puts it into sharp focus. I mean, you've got health risks that you're faced with if we don't look at green buildings, but also some clear opportunities from a value chain perspective, and also benefits from a cost perspective as you manage utility costs. And I think overall from a sustainability and an environmental perspective, also looking at savings from a water perspective. Lisa, from where you sit, which is really in the thick of policy and standards, what would you say has triggered a sense of urgency around green buildings?
Well, it's quite strange. So you say urgency, but I must just point out that the Green Building Council is 18 years old this year. And we felt the urgency back in 2007, and we knew it was coming, and but obviously it has really increased in this time. And I think Songo gave a good point. We used to always obviously we say, okay, green buildings are resource efficient, so your utility bills are better. And we used to talk about healthy buildings, but pre-COVID, this concept of healthy building didn't really resonate with anybody until suddenly you hit with this pandemic and you realize the value of the healthy building. So I must just point out, I always call myself a pragmatic hippie. I hug trees, but I also want to say this is the benefit of hugging the trees, so that so I think you with every sort of walk of life, wherever you go, you must speak that person or that sector's language. So when we look at the government, the regulatory side, we have to say, okay, South African government, you've signed the Paris Accord. We've got carbon reduction targets. We've got we've got a water crisis. We've got an energy crisis. How do we resolve this? So then we speak sort of policies, procedures, legislation, and that's where it comes in. And I think people have realized and are still realizing that climate change is going to hit Africa the worst. We can say, oh, if we change something, we're like 16% of the total world's carbon, for instance. And you say, well, but if the temperature increases by 2 degrees, we're talking 35 degrees to 37. We're talking 38 to 40. We're not talking little numbers. And I think if you look at it and suddenly climate change is upon us. We used to talk about climate change mitigation. We now talk about climate change adaptation. So even when you look, as Songo said, you design a building, it's going to last 40 to 50 years. How resilient is a building you're building today going to hold up to the climate of 50 years' time? And that's what we have to think of as well, is because you put a lot of money, these are assets that companies own, and suddenly you're saying, well, is my asset going to last its lifetime if I don't design and build properly? But of course, we have to speak then, what's the financial return? So that language, you speak to the financial guys. We talk wellness to certain population. Some people, we talk climate change, and it depends who are you talking to and what do you want out of it. And we say that green is for all, which I heartily believe and push. So we even work with, say, the Department of Human Settlements and saying, guys, don't build houses, build homes. Homes are where people are comfortable. Homes are where people live. And that's also where the concept of green comes in. It is that wellness and that sort of comfortable, thermally comfortable home that you don't have to, pump with burning fossil fuels inside your house. You really can build something that's comfortable, that you don't have to add heating and cooling to. You're getting water on tap, and you provided with everything that you need to really make your house a home.
And Songo, to bring you back into the conversation. So when we talk about green buildings in the South African context, what are the core features, especially then when you think about it from a climate resilience and energy use?
You walk into a room, the temperature is extremely cold. You're going to feel it, right? There are times where you walk into a room, you don't know that you're uncomfortable. And that's where really the idea of thermal comfort, we talk about thermal comfort and passive design concepts, is to be able to build with the sun in mind, build with natural technologies in mind before you bring in, your more, your big solar technologies. And that concept comes in the form of energy efficiency. We always talk about that silent kilowatt, right? And when it comes to energy, if we're to bring in as much energy efficiency in our planning efforts, without having to switch on a light bulb, without having to draw energy from the grid, without having to even draw energy from a solar panel, then, would have struck that good balance. So it's actually, if you think about it, even the concept of mud houses back in the day, we talk about natural building technologies. We, long before back in the day, we had passive design principles brought in from that time already, good thermal comfort levels coming out of natural building technologies beyond, these newer technologies that have come since then. And then obviously in there comes your really smart planning before you bring in, these heavy technologies in. So yeah, if I were to say holistically, it's really a building that's got good passive design principles, resource efficiency planning, and then obviously what you can't get from your efficiency measures, then you bring in your technological elements, which can come in the form of energy efficiency, your water efficiency technologies, and then there's many of these. And then obviously bringing in, your recycling, bringing in your, they always talk about the final touches, bringing in low VOC, talk about volatile organic compounds in your final touches, your coatings and things like that. That's where we also bring in air quality elements. So it's to even bring in the full picture, but start with the stuff that's going to not cost you anything. And that's where, things like passive design comes into play.
Some of the things that you're mentioning, they do seem to be non-negotiables in any building. Lisa, you touched on climate change as being a driver. So, from your perspective, then, how do these buildings meet our just transition goals or international commitments? And are we then genuinely currently integrating them as a country, or are we playing catch up at this point?
I think we're probably playing catch up at this point. Songo spoke about, COVID and sort of the Green Building Council. We said, we have to recover after COVID. Let's do a green recovery. And a green recovery includes green jobs. It's the green economy. And looking at, there was a paper written that to retrofit buildings into energy efficiency. So let's just talk energy for now. To retrofit buildings into energy efficiency creates more jobs than generating electricity. So think of how many people are in a power station that work in the power station, or even the coal mines, take it from the coal mines to the power station. If retrofitting, we probably got, when we look at different things, 150,000, 250,000 bigger buildings in the country. Now imagine if every one of those buildings had a retrofitting program, looking at insulation, shading over your windows, motion sensor lighting, or lighting retrofit, you know, films on your window, ceiling of doors, ceilings of windows. You know, there is, and if you think of it, even think of your own house. I mean, how many houses do you go to? You walk past the window and it's freezing by the window because it's just not well sealed. Now, imagine now you look at it in a larger scale, how many people can, you can create jobs. And by sealing that window, you're saving how much energy in the winter? And that's the thing is, and if we could get that mindset, we're saying, guys, there's retrofitting opportunities, because we've got a huge building stock that we need to bring into a certain level of performance. We want these buildings to perform at a certain level. And, as I said, it creates more jobs than mining and generating electricity. Look, we're going to create a lot of jobs. There's a lot of studies going on at the moment about how many jobs that can be created by solar power, which is true, but there's this hidden gem, and we're talking about passive design. And the passive comes from not having to be active and go and switch something on. You can sit in your office or your house and you feel comfortable, so you don't turn anything on. And that's the passive side of it. And it's really these huge amounts of job creation. If we look, we did our first certification in 2009, and we have these professional people called accredited professionals that assist people with the certification and the Green Star rating. In 2009, I think there might have been 2 companies that did it. Now, come 2025, we've got multiple small businesses that are all accredited professionals in the green space. So we've actually already created some green jobs along the way, but there's many more to out there that we just need to actualize them and sort of spread the message that, guys, you can bring a very old building into energy efficiency, into water efficiency. As Songo said as well, waste is a job creator on its own. We do well in South Africa with recycling of waste, because of the informal sector. We just need to add on to that and really, there's jobs there and we can create it. And it's just like, how do we step up and say, let's do this more, let's do this better.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Lisa. And I think, so broadly contributes to overall NDCs from a South African perspective, and in how we then in terms of the Paris Agreement. But beyond just from a global perspective, it also then has real local benefits that exists. I mean, opportunities you're mentioning from a retrofitting perspective. So, that seems like a really nice low-hanging fruit in terms of additional work that could be put in, as well as the creation of jobs. But then I guess my question then is, how do we, there's obviously the opportunity that sits on this side, as you've mentioned. There's the commitments that we've made under the Paris Agreement. How do we then translate these commitments then into a policy that gets us to this end place where, we're then able to drive these benefits? So, Lisa, I guess my question to you would be, if you had a chance, or you had the chance to drive just one policy shift to fast track green building adoption, what would that be?
I would really speak to somebody like Treasury, and a lot of countries you can have a rebate on your rates and taxes in some cities. You can, in Australia, they sort of take their houses from 1 to 5 stars. It's not to do with our certification. And, as you improve your house, you'll get some kind of rebate or a tax rebate. And I think that, if we can encourage, and often people are encouraged by their pockets, and, we love them to be encouraged by saving the planet, but let's stick with the pockets. And I think we could really, with that, you could build, a lot of sort of companies, a lot of opportunities for people to do this job. So I think there would have to be a commitment from government. We do have, sometimes we have a bit of a tug of war, because remember as well, energy and electricity is revenue for cities. So you'd have to say, well, how do we also ensure that the cities still, and cities and towns still work optimally, they still have some revenue that they can do the infrastructure, and that if we're going to save energy, obviously that basket of revenue goes down. So it's one of the things that we've always struggled to balance. But I think most cities, we've got some C40 cities in South Africa, a lot of the cities are saying, well, again, with electricity, if we load shed, you can't sell what we don't have on the shelves. Do you know what I mean? So sometimes that point gets moot. But I think it's really I think it's a comprehensive meeting and saying, guys, how do we sort out the reality of losing revenue with the reality of having to reduce our carbon, but add into the mix that, again, if the city encourages more small businesses, there's still revenue there that comes in from another stream. And it's just that, again, it's a transition to get into that space.
Thanks. That really, I mean, that would be a bold move in terms of from a citywide perspective, but also, touching on potential rebates at an individual level, which could really unlock some real momentum. And Songo, I want to, dig deeper into this idea or this concept of looking at rebates. I mean, we've seen solar incentives, tax incentives work. Should we be thinking about then similar mechanisms for green buildings, but obviously looking at green material or energy efficiency appliances? Should we be thinking around those lines? How could that work?
Look, I think on the energy efficiency side, there are actually a few tax incentives that do exist. I think there's the income tax, the 12L, that exists for taxpayers in South Africa. If you've got energy efficiency outputs as part of your projects. And basically how it works is for every kilowatt hour that you save, you get about the equivalent of 95 cents, and obviously that has to be independently verified by a measurement and verification professional. I mention this because a lot of other industries, heavy industries, have gone and actually taken advantage of this tax incentive, but a lot in the real estate industry haven't actually, of the bulk of and we've got a lot of building owners that haven't really unlocked this opportunity. So I think an advocacy message, I mean, particularly for this podcast and maybe even through the GPCSA, we can certainly push that narrative. But beyond that, when you look at materials, now I think there is definitely room to look at materials. It's just that because materials are such a wide concept, where do you start? Do you start with the bricks? Do you start with the paints? Do you start with, I think maybe the starting message is to I would probably start before the incentives. I'd start with strengthening the definition of green material. I think we've seen a lot of this in sustainability as a whole, this thing called greenwashing, where, a lot of material suppliers would be like, hey, my product is green. Based on what? Based on who said that? Who gave you the authority to say your product is green? So I think if we can get that right, and certainly I think partners like GPCSA, EcoSpecifier, all these industry players that are currently driving that. Maybe, I mean, Lisa mentioned the National Treasury. Maybe some of the carbon tax that's currently being charged to companies right now who are polluting, maybe some of that revenue can be recycled, and we can really strengthen our capabilities to really make our definitions almost like our green, I'm looking for the word, but basically the definitions around things like what is a green material in the built environment, and what is green really. If we can strengthen that definition using the existing mechanisms, then we can really be a bit closer in terms of providing those tax incentives. Otherwise, you introduce a tax incentive before you can validate, then you can potentially open yourself up to potential challenges.
What needs to be a shift, whether it's in mindset, whether it's in messaging, whether it's in design, to make green buildings feel more relevant and accessible to ordinary South Africans, but also be, it being clearly understood what the opportunity that green buildings can present.
People have that concept that green is these flagship buildings in the cities and things like that, and that anything to do with green or environmental is expensive. We do, Green Building Council does a study with the University of Pretoria every sort of second year, where the Department of Quantity Surveyors will check what does a sort of building as usual cost versus a green building. And we found that for a 4-star rated building, the differential is less than 3% at the moment. 6-star rating is probably a bit more, it's about sort of 5%. But the differential is definitely getting smaller over the time. So people are building better. And that's what we're trying to also say to people here. When we say it's achievable, it's not expensive. So I think also that mindset that green is expensive. And we spoke about the passive design stuff. And those are the low cost and no cost interventions. Before you start adding any technology to it, you do the basics. And that is not, it's not inexpensive, and it's got payback. That's the beauty of green buildings as well, is that whatever you put in, it's got payback sometimes less than 18 months. So what other thing do you do to your building that actually, after 18 months, for the rest of its life, it pays back? So I think that's that kind of mindset in saying, guys, one, it's not that expensive. Two, what you do, it comes back. And I think it's, and also that green is a journey. I think sometimes we are guilty of doing an all or nothing approach. Whereas if you look at it, you have to do a step-by-step thing. So with our existing building performance, you can actually start measuring your building. And I'm not saying necessarily certified, but you can measure your building and say, oh, I've only got a 1-star, because you can get a 1-star, but then you know where you are. You say, okay, let me now change 1 or 2 things in my building. Get that payback back into your pocket and do the next steps and do this journey of bringing your buildings into a green space. And because it's not an all or nothing thing. It's like anything, maybe some readers can relate. When you go on diet, you mustn't do a crash diet. You must do these things like one at a time and get better, and that's what we're trying to encourage as well. Say, guys, it's a journey. Start. Minimal capital expenditure, get the payback. With the saving, do a bit more. And I think that's really the encouragement is don't think of green and green buildings as this big monster child. It really isn't. It's something that you can tackle. It's easy to tackle, and it's worthwhile tackling.
Thank you for that, Lisa. I want to go back to and something you touched on earlier regarding the opportunities that green buildings presents. You also spoke about job creation. And from a South African context, I mean, South Africa's latest unemployment statistic came back at sitting at about 31.9% for the last quarter of 2024. And I think for us as South Africans, it's then a really stark reminder that jobs and inclusivity can't be afterthoughts, and that they have to be central themes to any conversations about a transition or South Africa's future. Songo, then how do we shift, how do we shift green buildings from being seen or being these eco luxuries that they're perceived to be, but for them to actually be a real source of opportunities, of jobs for communities or young people living in townships or in rural communities?
When we look at the global challenge, we're racing to this net zero, as an industry, but also we just trying to get to a place where we are got a better relationship with the climate than we currently have now. And the starting point is always say is education. I think there's just so much that can be done in terms of beyond advocacy, but actually formal education. And this is where you can probably bring in, the various stakeholders. I mean, it's good that you have this podcast, and I see that you're going to be reaching out to the youth soon, seeing that it's Youth Month. but really formalizing the education process, particularly around green buildings. I know organizations such as the GBCSA, they are doing that, but I do also believe that there's so much room to really bring it into the classroom. When we talk about classroom, foundation level, why are we not learning about green buildings in grade 1, in the first grade? I mean, I'll share the story because the first time I actually knew about conservation, it was actually introduced to me by my grandmother. Growing up in the village, I spoke about mud houses earlier. I mean, that was the first time I got introduced to my first green building, a mud house, which we had in my grandparents' house, and I got to learn about the efficacy of just the thermal properties that come with, being in a mud house. Yes, also there's some dangers, but we'll get to that. So yeah, just really bringing the education at that foundation level and then strengthening it and really bringing it, out at mass. And I think the best way to do it is just to teach them while they're still young, and then they will grow up with it. When you look at countries like Germany, they've really gotten that right. But also in other African countries, I can mention where we've done projects in Uganda. Their energy efficiency is not even something that's taught; it's something that's understood. So they don't have a choice but to be energy efficient. So I mean, yeah, I mean those kind of examples, and certainly when you now bring into by the time you get to the boardroom and decisions have to be made and you have to explain green premiums, it doesn't really become this, oh no, really? I gotta choose between shareholder revenue and and bring in a shared value, that's going to really it's gonna outlive everyone in this boardroom. So that's what I mean by that. By the time you get to the higher levels of education, it's already part and parcel of what the person is. I think definitely education, advocacy, formalizing it, getting rid of greenwashing, and certainly one way we can do that is, reinforce the education, but really also let's punish the people that are going out there saying that they've got green products when they don't have. In the same way that we've got a carbon tax for polluters, let's also tell the people that are saying that they are green, and tell them, maybe you can go to jail. I mean, an example is we've got this legislation called mandatory reporting of energy performance certificates, which basically requires eligible buildings, certain buildings, offices, schooling, infrastructure, for them to display, the energy performance of that building in a year. And it's by law, you have to do it. You don't have to particularly be an energy efficient building, but you have to disclose how much energy those buildings are consuming on a 12-month period. And if you don't, there's penalties that can get introduced. So certainly if we can get strengthen those legislations, right? So that by the time that we can start thinking about, strengthening the journey, as Lisa said, the green journey, bringing people on the green journey, people take us seriously. They don't just pay lip service to, to the industry as a whole, Yeah. So we look at the carrot and then we look at the stick, and then we really strengthen those mechanisms.
Thank you. Bringing forward some really, I think, important initiatives. Education becomes quite a very a key one. I think a lot doesn't happen, or a lot isn't moving from a transition perspective, simply because we're not really taking along everybody on this journey. And I think beyond just engaging and engaging with community members, but it's also then setting our children up for this future that we're heading towards. Are we, from a curriculum perspective, really training and educating young people to be future fit for these opportunities that are presented? But I think also the point that you're making, or what you're highlighting, is a real danger, or a real concern from a greenwashing perspective. And short of people telling on themselves, or really acting with the highest level of ethics, I think it's then for maybe perhaps even for the private sector to then consider, how do we then regulate amongst ourselves? Because government is obviously going to have policies in place, but as a private sector, if we've got to be thinking about, how do we keep this industry alive or build onto it? It brings me then to my next question, and Lisa, hearing from you then, in when we look at the private sector, and the various participants, are we actually collaborating enough? Is there sufficient collaboration within the private sector to actually ensure that we're driving these retrofits or the construction of these buildings in terms or in line with best practices? Or are we then still seeing then silos amongst different private sector actors around what these best practices or around implementing these best practices?
I think on the whole, in South Africa, probably the green movement has been led a lot by the private sector. In many countries around the world, it's led by regulation and regulatory practices. So you'll see countries with net zero targets, whereas in South Africa we started with our sort of net zero certification before the government, they spoke about it in the National Development Plan, but it hasn't been a sort of strong driver. So we've really been led by, a lot of it has been led by the private sector, based around the reporting that they have to do, because again, they have to be responsible citizens. And I think with the things like the ESG reporting, they've sort of had to show that, look, they are responsible players within this space. And the fact that it is also a bottom line, saving if your buildings are utility and resource efficient. And I think but it's mainly the bigger players within the space. We need more of these sort of owner-occupier type buildings, or the building owners that have got a small portfolio. We need more of them on board to really look at the bigger picture and say, yeah, let's drive this. Because it's really, there's some really nice things that are happening, in the space, and some innovative stuff. I'll just give you an example. There's some shopping centers with net zero waste certifications, and it's only possible because they involve everybody. So it's them, it's the people, the facilities managers, it's the tenants, it's the shoppers, and it's the community that they're in. So for instance, there's one shopping center that all the restaurants put the waste food into, and then they create the compost. And then the farmers around that area, all they have to do is fetch it. They don't have to pay for it. They can come and fetch compost from these places and use it. And then, so there's some brilliant ways of doing things. And I think a lot of the private sector has done it, and it's not always, it's not an income generator always. It's more a saving than bringing income in, because it's just, it helps these things work. So I think there's some really good stuff happening. Is it everybody? No. Just to let you know, since 2009, we have done over 1,400 certifications, many more buildings than that. So we need to really be, bringing out, and please trust me, it's not all about certifications, but it's about that saying, I'm not self-declaring that I'm green. I'm going through a robust process through an independent third party showing that I'm green. The other sort of commitment we've had, and it's been in the last few years, has been from the banks and the investment community, where they want to invest in things that are greener. They also want to report that, that my investment money or my loans went to saving off so much carbon. So we're finding that the banks and the investment community are also standing up and saying, let's try and drive the right sort of buildings, the right behavior, the right sort of investment for the future. Because again, remember, the banks are putting money into something that has to last decades. Banks are risk averse. They want to know that this is going to last. And they have really stepped up into the sort of sustainable finance space. Well, so the conversations we're having with banks and investment houses is around green investment. And I find that's a huge step forward. And we talk about incentives, and the private sector does incentivize people to do the right thing if they can get a better loan at better rates.
I'm now wondering then what from a government perspective, how government can assist, what government is doing, And Songo, I'd like to bring you back in here, and maybe let's talk around some of the obstacles that are preventing the adoption or the certification then of green buildings. And to hear from you, if you could clear, one hurdle, or, be it zoning, planning, or regulatory, if you could clear that one hurdle, what would that be? And what would you say is the hurdle that's currently slowing things down?
Ultimately, we always go back to the policy. I mean, I think the previous points you touched on as well, it's no coincidence that in as much as government sets the policy, but it's sitting with a lot of opportunities for the private sector. There's not a single private sector stakeholder that's not wanting to get into a room with government, right? I mean, earlier this year, I was at a conference in KwaZulu-Natal, which coincidentally, where we're actually doing quite a lot of green infrastructure projects as a company, where they're now saying they're seeing this retrofitting opportunity. They're looking at all these underutilized buildings in the province, and they're saying, well, we're going to start releasing these, phasing them out, value them, phasing them out, partner with the private sector through triple Ps, and actually implement, eco-friendly green assets, whether it be residential, to really revamp our CBDs, our inner cities, and things like that. And a lot of this thinking actually came through from COVID times, when we realized that when we're all sitting in our homes and away from our offices, and now we're sitting with inner cities that are getting dilapidated. So, government is starting to wake up, slowly but surely, starting to wake up and saying, they're sitting with assets, prize assets, and willingly, they're starting to now realize that, okay, a lot of that capital is sitting with the private sector, but what we need to do, we need to probably start ring fencing some of these deals, so that when the money comes in through a triple P, we don't now go and spend this and look at all the revenue that we're losing from the electricity that we're not selling. Let's ring fence it into these triple P type projects, where we can actually start sharing in the benefits. So I would say what's probably lagging there is really quite a lot of education, even around how these frameworks start getting implemented. Especially where government sits, where they're playing regulator, but they also want to play player. So it does create a bit of a dichotomy for them. But ultimately, it's good to see, and it's encouraging. Like I said, when I was in KZN earlier this year, and I saw that, okay, the government's really starting to really see the opportunity of partnering a bit strongly with the private sector, and realizing that there actually is so many opportunities in terms of how you can design programs that work for both parties. And I mean, look, I don't blame the government so much. I mean, we had a time in South Africa where we were building soccer stadiums, and there was quite a time where there was price fixing and things like that. I mean, I think we've recovered quite significantly in terms of just repairing that relationship between the two. The two really need each other, and the green buildings offer a great opportunity where we can have those green triple P deals. I mean, a good example is infrastructure programs such as the Gautrain. We've got the Environment House in Pretoria. That's actually a triple P that came out. And that's actually a very good example. We just need to see more and more of those projects as we look to really achieving the net zero targets by 2050.
Thank you for that. And I guess really highlighting the big opportunity at a macro level, because obviously from a retrofitting perspective, and if we were to think about all of the government buildings that they are, it's quite a big project that would need to actually be done, and we're talking about a large amount of private sector investment that would be necessary to move that along the lines. But I want us to close off with thinking of the ordinary South African who's just living their day-to-day life, so somebody who doesn't necessarily have a budget or this massive decision-making party power, but say a parent at a school or a member of a church, any ordinary South African, how can they actually be part of this movement?
I think it's awareness. It really is about awareness and Songo said education. So it's not a quick process. And I think we need to find ways of bringing this awareness around to more people. And I think because we've got champions within a lot of spaces, people that see what's happening, and they spread the news, and I think it's going to schools, and really sort of tapping the like-minded people, and they and saying, okay, well, how can you in your space, how can you make the difference? Because that's the other thing is as I say, it's not this. If we think about tackling climate change, it's too big for all of for one person to do. But if each of us did something, look at it this way: in the heart of load shedding, if every building saved 10% of their energy, there would be a whole power station we wouldn't need, because that energy saving would make up the energy that's generated by a power station. And I think if we can get those types of messages through, and we're a membership driven organization, so we do a lot of events. We do what we call planet shapers, and we invite people from different places. We do training with universities. We do some school tours. We take them to buildings, and we need to do more of these kind of things. It's sometimes our constraint is capacity. We're a small organization, but we do have our supporters and our members like Green PDG, who then spread the message and actually do the work. So it's really about just getting the like-minded people to just speak out about it. And it's a pity in a way that's within the global space that climate change has become a political issue in some places, which it shouldn't be. That's not where it belongs. It belongs in, we have to make a change. We have to do something about this. It doesn't have to be extreme. It doesn't have to be tomorrow, but take those steps forward.
Thank you very much for that. Songo, maybe closing off with you and something we can leave our listeners with, a piece of advice in terms of something they can do. What is the one action that an ordinary South African can take today, whether they're in government, renting a flat, or running a business? What's that one action they can take that they can take today?
Drawing from my foundation, so charity begins at home. Know your kilowatt hour, know how much electricity you're consuming in your household, before you can know how much your office or your clients kilowatt hours are. And the same goes for all the other resources that we spoke about, whether it be waste. Where's our waste going, as a home? Where's our waste going as an office? And that's where these projects actually, start. How much water we're consuming? Do we actually know that we're a water-stressed country? So those kind of things, I think those things you can introduce at different levels, whether it be at a foundation level, we're introducing it through a grade 1 type of context, or in a home environment or an office environment. So those type of things, I think those are things that we can certainly access as people. And they're not being afraid of technology. I mean, these days, sure. I mean, AI, guys, from typing an email to figuring out, what is green, just go on the internet, just not be afraid of technology in terms of what it can bring and the benefits it can certainly bring, the green messaging. I mean, seeing this podcast, we didn't have a podcast, an energy podcast in South Africa during COVID. so I mean, all those elements really do add to the advocacy that Lisa spoke about, but also certainly ensuring that we're all, in our small way, no matter how big it is, we're all really adding to this green journey and really being advocates and really being, champions in our own homes, in our own spaces. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that practical advice and what ordinary South Africans can actually do to really get involved in this movement and in participating. I think what would be important, or a great way to really end off today's podcast episode would really to get a visual or better be able to understand what does a successful green building project actually look like, and really what is the impact that one could expect to see from these kind of projects. And Lisa, I'd like to then close off with you and ask from you, is there a project that comes to mind that really shows green buildings as being inclusive, cost effective, and scalable?
Thank you for that. There is a wonderful homegrown example of a certified certified complex, and it's in the social housing space. We did a project in Belhar where it was sort of flats from bachelor, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom flats, and it was certified. It had sort of joint heat pumps, really nicely designed, and people moved into the space. And with the saving on the utility bills in some of the houses in the 2-bedroom apartments, they basically saved 2 months' rent in utilities. So they basically paid 10 months for 12 because of what was saved in that building. But what came with it is such a sense of pride. It's within a sort of complex. People are looking after that complex. They don't want anything, to change. They don't want to disturb the sort of the balance that it's got. And I mean, to me, that's such a nice example where it's impacted people's lives, and they've got more spending money because they're not wasting it on energy that they would have wasted and water that they would have wasted. And it's well documented. So if you want the link, I can send it to you. But it's really, it's as I say, it's a wonderful example of where green is for all and where it really, really works.
Thank you very much for that uplifting or inspiring story around green buildings. We'll certainly share more details of that project as we distribute the episode. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Energy Conversations. Songo, Lisa, thank you very, very much for your time and invaluable insights. We really appreciate the wisdom, the examples, and the clarity that you have brought to today's conversation. In today's conversation, or in today's episode, we really unpacked why green buildings matter now more than ever, not just as a climate solution, but as an enabler for jobs, a saving of resources, as well as a saving from a time and long-term affordability perspective. We also explored the need to shift mindsets and policies around sustainable infrastructure. We were able to unpack the role of green design in helping South Africa meet its just energy transition and Paris Agreement commitments. And we also really learned learned more around existing incentives that are in place in the green building space, specifically from energy efficiency perspective. So looking at Section 12L of the Income Tax Act. We also looked at the opportunities or the potential for green buildings to really drive local innovation, democratize access, and really significantly be a cost saver for ordinary South Africans. And I think what's also been quite helpful or really powerful about this episode is that we've learned about how, as individuals, whether or not you have any capital to be able to do the necessary retrofitting, can already start taking some passive design elements or some initial work in how you are utilizing your space, and be able to advocate for or start advancing cleaner, greener spaces for yourself and within the community. What we've realized, though, at the end of this whole conversation is that green buildings and the entire ecosystem is really not just abstract ideas. Everything that we've learned today, it really forms part of building blocks of a more sustainable and equitable South Africa. To our listeners, we thank you for joining us again. And if you found this episode insightful, we ask you that you please share it with your network, follow Energy Conversations, and subscribe to join us in shaping South Africa's energy story together. Until next time, let's keep the conversation going.
Thank you for joining us on the Energy Conversations podcast, powered by Bayaka Infrastructure Partners, an authorized financial services provider, and the African Energy Leadership Center at the Wits Business School. Together, we are committed to empowering communities and fostering meaningful dialogue around the South African energy sector. Remember to subscribe and let's shape South Africa's energy future together.